For 25 years, one man ruled Russia, not through fear alone, but through a contract written in silence. Vladimir Putin's secret pact, wealth in exchange for loyalty. A deal so powerful, it transformed warlords into billionaires, criminals into statesmen, and businessmen into obedient servants of the Kremlin throne. The rule was simple: stay out of politics, and I'll make you rich beyond imagination. Challenge me, and I'll erase you from history. For decades, it worked. Russia's oligarchs grew fat on oil, gas, and gold, while Putin became the symbol of unshakable power. His image, the strongman who restored order after the chaos of the 1990s, became sacred. But that illusion ended the moment Russian tanks crossed the Ukrainian border on February 24, 2022. The invasion was meant to be Putin's crowning triumph, the lightning war that would crush Kiev in 3 days and terrify the West into submission. Instead, it became the beginning of his empire's decay. The sanctions that followed didn't just target Russia's economy, they shattered the unspoken deal that held the Kremlin together. Yachts in Sardinia seized, mansions in London frozen, billions in offshore accounts vanished overnight. For the first time, the oligarchs realized their wealth, their security, even their lives, were never truly theirs. They had merely been on loan from Putin himself. And as Russia's war machine began to stumble, so did the myth of its architect. Inside the Kremlin's marble halls, the whispers grew louder. Some of Putin's oldest allies were vanishing, some were fleeing, and others were dying in silence. From the shadows of this collapsing empire rises a chilling truth. The greatest threat to Vladimir Putin isn't NATO nor Ukraine. It's the people inside his own palace. In this documentary, we uncover the hidden war within Russia's elite. A power struggle fought not with tanks, but with assassinations, betrayals, and backroom deals. We'll trace the fall of 3 key figures: Mikhail Friedman, Oleg Tinkov, and Yevgeny Prigozhin, each representing a different form of rebellion inside the Kremlin's decaying machine. We'll expose how Putin's economic pact has turned into a system of silent purges. And finally, we'll ask, what happens when the Tsar loses control of his own court? Because behind the facade of Russian strength lies a deeper, quieter war. The war for survival among the men who once swore absolute loyalty to the Kremlin.
To understand how the collapse began, we must go back to the roots of Putin's empire of loyalty, a system built not on ideology but on fear and profit. When Vladimir Putin rose to power in 1999, Russia was a fractured state. The Soviet collapse had left chaos, mafia wars, bankrupt industries, and corrupt politicians feeding off the carcass of a dying superpower. Amid this ruin, Putin appeared as a man of order, a former KGB officer promising to bring Russia back to its feet. His method was simple: stability through submission. He reached out to the oligarchs, the billionaires who controlled Russia's oil, metals, and media, and offered them a new deal. You keep your wealth, I keep the power. It was a Faustian pact. In exchange for loyalty, these men gained the world. They funded Putin's political machine, sponsored state propaganda, and helped forge the myth of the strongman who restored Russia's pride. Through the 2000s, Putin's image grew, crushing rebellions in Chechnya, confronting Georgia, and seizing Crimea in 2014 without a single major battle. His victories were not just military, they were symbolic. Each triumph told the Russian people, "Only I can protect you from chaos." But power built on loyalty has a fatal flaw. It survives only as long as the rewards keep flowing. When the West imposed sanctions after Crimea, the cracks began to form. Still, oil money kept the illusion alive. That illusion shattered entirely in February 2022. The invasion of Ukraine was meant to be Putin's final masterpiece, the event that would cement him in history as the man who rebuilt the Russian Empire. Instead, it exposed the rot. Within weeks, Russia's 3-day operation turned into a quagmire. Videos of destroyed tanks flooded social media. Soldiers mutinied. Sanctions hit harder than ever. And for the first time, the oligarchs, men who had built palaces, yachts, and entire cities under Putin's rule, saw their fortunes evaporate overnight. The Western trap had snapped shut. Accounts were frozen. Jets were grounded. Family members abroad faced travel bans. Suddenly, The empire of loyalty no longer looked invincible. It looked cursed. Inside Moscow, fear turned to suspicion. Putin's inner circle began whispering, not about the war, but about the future. Was this the beginning of the end? Who would inherit the throne if the Tsar fell? And more importantly, who would survive? The collapse of trust inside the Kremlin had begun, and from this moment forward, every handshake, every meeting, every smile carried the scent of betrayal. Every empire falls not from the outside, but from within. And inside Putin's fortress, the walls began to crack, not from bombs, but from betrayal. The first defection came from Mikhail Friedman, one of the original oligarchs of the 1990s, a man who once sat at the very core of the Kremlin's financial machine. Founder of Alpha Bank, Friedman wasn't a crude power broker. He saw himself as a global businessman, polished, Western, civilized. From his London mansion, he funded charities, mingled with European elites, and carefully built an image that said, "I am Russian, but not Putin's man." Then came February 2022. When tanks rolled into Ukraine, Friedman made a gamble that would destroy everything he built. He issued a public letter calling the war a tragedy, pleading for peace, thinking it would protect him from sanctions. But the West saw him differently. To them, he was one of Putin's wallets, one of the men who enabled the system in the first place. Sanctions froze his empire. His accounts were seized, his freedom restricted. Meanwhile, the Kremlin saw his letter as treason. Russian state media branded him a coward and traitor. In one move, Friedman became an exile from both worlds, rejected by the West and condemned by Moscow. Then came Oleg Tinkov, Russia's maverick tech billionaire, founder of Tinkoff Bank. He was no ordinary oligarch. Loud, rebellious, and Western in spirit, he mocked Soviet rigidity and idolized Silicon Valley. But when war erupted, even he hesitated, until April 2022. That month he broke his silence, calling the invasion insane, the army useless, and Kremlin officials stupid. This wasn't diplomacy, it was defiance. Within days, the Kremlin moved. His bank was threatened with nationalization unless he resigned. He was forced to sell his multi-billion-dollar empire for 3% of its real value, to none other than Vladimir Putin, Putin's new favorite. It was daylight robbery disguised as patriotism. Tinkov fled Russia and renounced his citizenship, saying, "I cannot be part of a country at war with its own soul." But the darkest act came from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the monster born of the system itself. Once Putin's personal chef and the commander of the Wagner mercenaries, he was the fist that struck where Moscow's laws couldn't reach. Yet when his soldiers began dying by the thousands in Ukraine, and Moscow's generals hid behind lies, Prigozhin's loyalty snapped. In June 2023, his army marched toward Moscow, seizing Rostov without resistance. For 24 hours, the unthinkable happened. Putin's control vanished. The Tsar had to negotiate with his own general. 2 months later, Prigozhin's private jet exploded midair. It was the loudest message in Russian history. Loyalty is rewarded. Betrayal is erased. These three men, Friedman, Tinkov, Prigozhin, represent the three faces of rebellion: the naive, the defiant, and the doomed. When Yevgeny Prigozhin's jet fell from the sky, a message thundered through Moscow louder than any explosion. The message was clear: the Tsar forgives nothing. But the cost of vengeance was deeper than the Kremlin realized. Inside Russia's elite circles, the ministries, the energy boardrooms, the intelligence corridors, fear mutated into paralysis. Every oligarch, every general, every aide began asking the same question: who's next? In the weeks after Prigozhin's death, a quiet purge began. Dozens of businessmen suddenly vanished from public view. Some retired, others fell ill. A few fell out of windows. It was an invisible war, not on the battlefield, but in penthouses and boardrooms. Putin's circle, once bound by shared profits and ambition, turned into a maze of suspicion. Meetings grew shorter. Phones were left outside rooms. Even among friends, voices dropped to whispers. Nobody trusted anyone. Because in Putin's Russia, loyalty wasn't rewarded, it was tested. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine dragged on, draining billions, bleeding soldiers, and eroding the very illusion of control that Putin had spent 2 decades building. The oligarchs who once feasted on Kremlin contracts now faced bankruptcy. Their villas in Nice and yachts in Monaco were gone. Their families were trapped by sanctions, and suddenly, the empire they had helped create had turned on them. But perhaps the most dangerous change came from within the security services, the FSB and GRU. They had watched the Wagner rebellion with horror. They saw tanks rolling toward Moscow, generals negotiating on live television, and the president retreating into silence for 48 hours. In the shadows, a realization spread. Putin could bleed. Putin could panic. Putin could fall. The system that once seemed eternal was now showing its age. Behind the Kremlin's golden walls, the old guard began preparing for the inevitable, not rebellion, but survival. Some started moving money quietly offshore, using shell networks in the Middle East and Central Asia. Others sought political insurance, pledging loyalty to whoever might come next. For ordinary Russians, none of this was visible. The propaganda machine kept humming, loud, confident, triumphant. But inside the corridors of power, the silence was deafening. No laughter in the dachas, no champagne at the banquets, just the cold understanding that one wrong word could end a dynasty or a life. Putin had built his empire on fear. Now, that same fear had come full circle, consuming the empire itself. And as history has shown, once paranoia takes hold of a ruler, the countdown begins. The question was no longer if the Tsar would fall. It was when, and who would dare to replace him. Empires never announce their fall. They unravel quietly, piece by piece. And for Russia, that unraveling has already begun. To the outside world, the Kremlin still looks unshakable. Granite towers, golden domes, endless parades. But beneath that facade, the structure is hollow. Each failed offensive in Ukraine, each coffin returning home, each Western sanction chips away at the foundation of Putin's myth. Military analysts describe it as controlled decay, a system still functioning on paper but collapsing in spirit. No one dares to challenge Putin directly, yet everyone is preparing for his absence. Inside Russia's elite, 2 camps have quietly formed, the survivalists and the restorers. The survivalists, led by aging security chiefs and hardline generals, believe the only way forward is more repression, more war, more fear. They would rather burn Russia to the ground than lose their grip on power. The restorers, younger technocrats and oligarchs exiled in London, Dubai, and Istanbul, see a different future, one where Russia returns to the world, rebuilds its economy, and escapes the prison of isolation. But for either side to win, Putin must fall, and that fall could happen in 3 ways. Scenario 1. The silent coup. One morning, Kremlin cameras go dark. The spokesman announces Putin is ill. Behind closed doors, the Security Council replaces him with a loyal successor. Perhaps a face already known, perhaps a ghost no one expects. No riots, no headlines, just silence. That's how most empires end, with a whisper. Scenario 2. The people's eruption. A military defeat triggers protests across Russia. Mothers, veterans, workers. The security services hesitate to open fire. The machine breaks from below, not above. It's the 1917 formula reborn, a revolution not of ideology, but exhaustion. Scenario 3. The fragmentation, the most feared outcome. Regional governors and security elites carve Russia into competing zones. Moscow loses control, and the world's largest nuclear power splinters. Western analysts call it the nightmare scenario, because a fractured Russia doesn't just threaten itself, it threatens everyone. Whichever scenario unfolds, one truth remains. The age of Putinism is ending. History's clock is ticking, and no ruler, however feared, escapes it. The question is not how Putin will fall. It's how Russia will survive afterward.